get to America?
Hey, Bri, I want to meet Mickey Mouse.
Or does Mickey Mouse want to meet you, John?
Does anyone want to meet you, John?
Does anyone want to meet us?
How do you mean?
Well, America's got everything she wants, right? What does she want with the Beatles?
Yeah, that's true. America chews up pop artists like bubble gum.
Can these possibly be four lads who are supposed to be revolutionizing the world of popular music, afraid to go to America?
Yeah, that's us.
If we stand still, we'll just fade away like the rest of them. Anyway, the biggest risk you took was to make me your manager.
Yeah, I've been meaning to talk to you about that for a while, Brian. Now, just get your hands back on that wheel.
Yeah, we had nothing to lose in them days.
My bonnie lies over the sea. My bonnie lies over the ocean. Oh, bring back my bonnie to me.
Glass Onion. John Lennon.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 111 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. And this is following on pretty seamlessly from John Yoko, A Love Story, Birth of the Beatles, the 1979 biopic of the early Beatles. This is going to be a pretty deep dive, pretty much scene by scene. Just before I get to that, I thought I would do something that I haven't done for quite a long time on this podcast, over 2 years I think, which is to offer you a little bit of a guitar lesson. It's actually two. It's a two-in-one, but the songs are both very similar because one inspired the other one, and also very simple as well. So this is not going to be too long. I was somewhat prompted. It was a bit of a coincidence, actually, because I was thinking of doing this a couple of months ago, and then Matt Williamson from Pop Goes the 60s contacted me and said he wanted to do a show about the Beatles' isolated guitar tracks, which turned out to be an episode of his show called Beatles Guitar Shop. And that came out recently, so you can actually see me as well demonstrating a few of these Beatles songs. So I thought, an appropriate time to do this. So what we're going to be looking at, first of all, we're going to have a quick look at the Bob Dylan song, Masters of War. And I'm sure the Lennon aficionados can then work out which John Lennon song I'm going to demonstrate after that. But let's have a quick look at the Bob Dylan one. Yeah, Masters of War from 1963. If you are a guitarist, you want to have a go at this. It's very simple. So you need a capo on the 3rd fret, and the song is actually in F minor. So you're playing D minor. D minor is the main shape. Obviously, capoed on the 3rd fret becomes F minor. So you just strum the D minor, and then if you take the 1st and 2nd fingers off and do a hammer on, you get something like, there it is. It's quite nice. I think I'm going by different versions. I try not to stick slavishly to the recorded versions of songs when I'm doing these kind of things, because if the artist has played the song live, they may well have changed it around a bit. So I think when I originally learned this, I just took off the 2nd finger, so you get. But if you take off the 1st finger as well, you get a kind of a harmony with that. So it's put them together. So then you go, come ye masters of war. And typically with Dylan, you don't really get verse, chorus, bridge, as you would get with most Beatles songs of that period. You just get a couple of changes. Masters of war, dun, dun. You to build all the guns, you to build the death planes. And then he moves to C. Now I play a kind of, I think it's a C add 9th. Rather than just play a straight C. And you know, that's just my little variation. I'm not sure exactly what Bob played, but so if you play a kind of a so if you do the first verse, it'd be build the big guns, you that build the death planes, you that build all the bombs. So on the word build all the bombs. And he goes, you hide behind walls, hide behind desks. I just want you to know. Now you could do a little trick. Just put the C, you got the C note on the A string on the 3rd fret. Disregarding the capos, it's technically on the 6th fret, but move the bass down. Which actually sounds a little bit like on It's Alright Ma, I'm Only Bleeding. Anyway. I just want you to know I can see through your masks. And that's basically Masters of War. There's not really much more to it. Go forward 7 years, Plasticono Band. So this time we're in A minor rather than F minor. But the chords are, depending how you play it, basically the same. This is obviously Working Class Hero. We're in A minor, and what John does, he doesn't exactly copy the Dylan strumming pattern. It's obviously a 3/4 time as well. So you play an open A, and then hammer on the open to 2nd fret on the D string. This is actually a song I used to play live. More on that later. So I know this one pretty well. Soon as you're born, they make you feel small. And you don't have to play a full G. I just played it on the low note, so. By giving you no time instead of it all. Till the pain is so big you feel nothing at all. I'll just do the first verse. A working class hero is something to be. So you're only going A minor. Working class hero is something G to be. So that is technically the chorus, but the guitar hasn't changed at all. The only change comes, a working class hero is something to be. So on John's it's clearer, it's A minor, G, D, A minor. But if you remember, I'll just go back to the Bob Dylan one, playing it without the capo. So we had D minor, then went to C, and then D minor, which is the same. John Lennon's going A minor to G to A minor, which is the same in a different key. And then I said earlier with Dylan, do that trick. So with Working Class Hero, working class hero is something, that's a D, but you could go working class hero is something to be, with the bass going down to F sharp, which is part of the D chord. The only real reason I'm mentioning that is to say that really the chords are the same, but he's changed it a little bit. The strumming pattern's a little bit different with that hammer on. Now, quite an interesting thing happens in the recording. I'm strumming over the sound hole here to get quite a nice, quite a rich, open sound. But then I always noticed this, but I didn't know until recently that the song is actually 2 different cuts edited together, and not very subtly either. It's almost like the famous cut in Strawberry Fields Forever. Suddenly, when you get to the 3rd verse, it suddenly moves to near the bridge. So you sort of go from... Suddenly it goes... And I think he does something like that. I mean, when I got the Plasticono box set, there was lots of different versions. So again, I'm doing a mixture. So you get this sort of very spiky, and the vocal sounds different as well, but it's kind of appropriate because he's singing when they've tortured and scared you for 20 odd years. So when you're using words like tortured and scared, it's obviously pretty intense, so that the spikiness works. Then they expect you to pick a career. When you can't really function, you're so full of fear. And I think at that point it goes back to Over the Sound Hole. And it's open again. So yeah, not a very subtle edit there, but hey. A couple of other bits. Another thing with the guitar, occasionally he goes... So that's just on the A minor, just playing an open A minor. Play the G, D, and then A. The strings G, D, and A. And that's basically it. There's just a vocal thing he does, which is quite good. A working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be. So it's just changing it a little bit. More urgency. I'm not going to scream here, ladies and gentlemen. You can listen to John's recording for that. But yeah, more urgency. And then just at the very end, working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be. And then we just get a different lyric at the end. If you want to be a hero, just follow me. So same chords. Want to be a hero, well, just G, follow D, and then A minor. Back to the spiky near the bridge. Open bottom E. And that's it. Working Class Hero. Pretty simple, but obviously a very effective song. And Masters of War as well. Right, let's get to Birth of the Beatles. It's a 1979 American biopic, produced by Dick Clark Productions and directed by Richard Marcon, if that's the way he pronounced his name. He was actually a Welsh director, and amazingly, 4 years after Birth of the Beatles, he went on to direct Return of the Jedi. And in fact, after that, he directed Jagged Edge, which is quite a Hitchcockian thriller, starring Jeff Bridges and Glenn Close. And then in 1987, he directed Hearts of Fire, which was a Bob Dylan vehicle, which, like most of Bob's film adventures, was a little bit uneven. This film was shown as a TV film on ABC in the United States, but received a theatrical release in other countries. The film focuses on the early history of the Beatles and was released 9 years after the band disbanded. I always say the Beatles actually broke up in 1969, or that's when they ceased to be a functioning unit, but obviously it was made official in 1970. Now, there's a few points of interest with this film. I'll give you my opinion on it generally in a minute, but as with John Yoko, A Love Story, I think the amount of notes I've made doesn't quite reflect my opinion of the film. In other words, I've got pages and pages here, so I'm going to be going pretty deep, and really, because I'm so fascinated now by the Liverpool period of their lives, just before they became famous, I'm going to be talking about maybe the real events, obviously comparing them with the way they're depicted here, because this film is not particularly accurate, but some of those things are clearly deliberate choices. It's not that the screenwriter necessarily made lots of mistakes. There were some things, of course, that weren't known or that were popularly believed in 1979 that have been, debunked, or you know what it's like, the history is always changing, even though the events happened such a long time ago. And one of the main points of interest is that Pete Best served as a technical advisor for the production, and I think we will see his influence a couple of points later, which I'll point out. On that, just reading from Wikipedia here, the film has been said to reflect Best's personal account of certain events, for example, implying that Best was terminated from the band because of their resentment towards his popularity in Liverpool. And there is quite a strange scene, in fact, where they're in John Lennon's bedroom. John Lennon actually refers to them as Pete Best and his sods, when Pete Best isn't even there, which is a bit strange. There's no mention of dissatisfaction with Best's playing. As I said, I'll mention a couple of things that I noticed later, which weren't in the thing on Wikipedia. In Tune In, which I think we'll get a mention as well later, Mark Lewison's book, he mentions that Bert Kaempfer, when they made the 1961 recordings, took away some of Pete's drums, and we'll probably talk about that when we get to the actual sacking in the film. We did cover it, Ghosty and I, in the 1962 shows as well, a couple of years ago. But this is also the only biographical film about the band to be released while all four members were alive. And makes me wonder, did John get to see this at the Dakota? It has been said that all four Beatles tried to stop this being made, so I don't know whether they saw any of it or they just didn't like the idea in principle. It would be interesting to know what John would have thought if he'd seen it. Maybe he would have found it quite funny. I think, like John Yoko, A Love Story, there is quite a lot of unintentional humour in here, and it is somewhat laughable. The film was allowed to use songs written by the Beatles, but rather than the original recordings, the songs in the film were recorded by the Beatles' tribute act, Rain. And later on I make a comparison to the Backbeat Band. So I will be mentioning Backbeat a few times, and also Nowhere Boy as well, because those two films covered some of the same ground as this film. The covers by Rain, they're okay, but they're very lightweight, quite a thin sound, and you don't get any sense of the excitement of the band, really. The film received modest ratings when it premiered on American television and was repeated in January 1981 as a tribute to John Lennon in the weeks after his murder. Now, one of the reasons I'm covering this film is that it does have a special place in my heart, because I actually know when I first saw this. It was the morning of Friday, August the 5th, 1988. And the reason I know that is that, I don't know if I've mentioned this on this podcast, I think I've mentioned it on another one, that I found this TV database, TV and radio database, in fact, where you can basically look at when anything was shown on British TV or radio. So I know when this was, and I remember my sisters and I, we decided, I think we only lasted about a week, but during those summer holidays from school, we decided to tape whatever was the late film and watch it the next morning together. And this was one of those. This was really the first Beatles thing I ever saw, other than the fact that obviously I grew up in England, so their songs were around, and I'm sure I saw little bits of them on the TV or whatever. So this was the start of the love affair, let's be honest. And I remember halfway through it, I've got a funny memory for small details, even from 37 years ago. Wow. I remember halfway through it, my sister saying, how come John Lennon isn't a hippie in this? And that was the first time I'd heard the word hippie. And then, of course, I was curious. And sometime after that, obviously there wasn't any Wikipedia around then, but somehow I would have found out about John Lennon probably through books from my local library, and discovered that, he changed his appearance a lot. So that was part of the curiosity. And as long-term listeners will know, the Ray Coleman book that I read in 1989, so about a year after this, I got it for my birthday, in fact, which is also August, so about a year after this, that got me started properly on the Lennon journey. And so through this TV database and through my memory, I've been trying to trace my Beatles fandom and what were the first things I saw. And in fact, I think I mentioned this on the John Yoko Love Story episodes. That was one of the first as well, a few months after this. As I said right at the top of the show, this follows on quite neatly from John Yoko, A Love Story. I think it's about on a par with it, and it's got such TV movie traits, which Ghosty and I tried to identify on the other shows. As I mentioned, it did get a theatrical release in other countries, but watching this for a podcast and without the nostalgia of that first viewing, it is pretty bad, but with a few good moments, a couple of good lines, and it does to some extent capture a time and place, i.e. working class Liverpool in the late 50s and early 60s, rather like Nowhere Boy would 30 years later. The first thing to say really about this, certainly from the John Lennon perspective, this is the John-led Beatles, as in Tune In. As I said, John was the main man up to a certain point. a lot of people, including me, would say that the John and Paul dynamic evened out around 66. Maybe Paul starts to take over the reins in 67, and then very much so in 68, 69. Although, of course, John's ego made a comeback after it had been destroyed by acid in 68. So it's all quite debatable. But what you really have here is John is almost a guru to the others, doing what would now be called life coaching, I suppose. He's the world-weary cynic who seems to have seen it all, and his is certainly the deciding vote. And I would argue that even in reality, up to about 1969, which is, as I said, the last real year of the band, when he was into it, the whole band were, and the real Paul's role seemed to be diplomat a lot of the time. And Rod Davis and Colin Hanton said that Paul had that diplomatic side to him, even from the early Quarrymen days. And he almost became placater of John in the later years. And I've talked before about Paul being the adult to John's child in a funny way, even though he was younger. I don't mean that in a transactional analysis kind of way, but just in a more... John had those childlike tendencies that he possibly never lost, really. Now, one of the reasons that John comes across as this guru, a much older figure, is that famously, some of you will know this, Stephen McKenna, who played John Lennon, was 35 when he made this, which calls to mind, I don't know, for example, Dustin Hoffman being 30 in The Graduate, playing much younger, and especially Stockard Channing playing Rizzo in the original Grease, and she was 33 playing a high school senior. So that's about the same as here. But I was quite interested to find that, in fact, the actors playing the other Beatles were also quite a bit older, because John looks so much older than everyone here. But I said he's 35. Rod Culbertson playing Paul McCartney was actually 29. John Altman, who I mentioned in the shows with Ghosty because I couldn't get away from the fact that he'd been Nick Cotton in EastEnders, and the fact that he doesn't really look anything like George here and doesn't particularly act like George didn't help. So he was 27. The guy playing Ringo, Ray Ashcroft, was 27. Stu Sutcliffe was 23. That's why the sort of life coach thing happens a lot with Stu. There's a 12-year difference between them, the actors. And I didn't really feel there was any great chemistry there or any equal chemistry between John and Stu here. Brian Jameson as Brian Epstein was 31. So it fits in a way. He's a bit older than Paul, George and Ringo, but he's still 4 years younger than John. I'll mention a few other cast members later. I wasn't able to find the age of the actor who played Pete Best, but anyway, you get the idea. Now, in terms of accents, I mean, they're all quite Yellow Submarine, really, the Yellow Submarine film. John's accent, I would say, is more broad Lancashire than Liverpool. But Rod Davis did say that if you came from Wilton, you didn't really have that anything like that guttural scouse that you might find in somewhere like Bootle or Garston. Liverpool used to be part of Lancashire, so I'd say he's doing a Lancashire accent. Paul and George have a go at a Scouse accent. John Altman, as said as George, was definitely a Southerner. Ringo's accent is quite light, as is Stu's. I'd say Stu's is just more generic Northern English. And then obviously Brian Epstein and George Martin's accents, they have that clipped quality. Aunt Mimi, quite hilariously, has a Scouse accent, as she did in John Yoko A Love Story. To, hardened Beatles fan watching the John Yoko film or this film, there is that element of comedy, just seeing Aunt Mimi with that accent, because we've heard her. You can see an interview she did in 1981, where she's got a touch of Liverpool, a touch of the North, but nothing like as broad as this. Getting to the film itself, as I've already said, there are numerous mistakes. I'll mention some of them, some I won't bother with. I think in biopics, timelines always go a bit awry, but there's a kind of a logic to the timeline. Again, I'll guide you along with that. Got a lot to cover here. There are actually two versions of the film. The European version, apparently, is the one that starts in 1961, and I think they go straight to the My Bonnie, quite soulful version of My Bonnie. And then you see the caption says Liverpool, England, 1961. I think that's the one that's got the description at the beginning talking about the group Rain performing the songs and the recollections of Pete Best. But the American version, which I would consider is the proper version, has a really nice prologue where we're in the present, which is 1964, and the boys are in a limo on their way to the airport, I guess. It's not really, is it a limo or a black cab? And then we wind back 5 years to the start of the journey. So you get a 5-year journey, because in the other one, 1961, that wouldn't really make too much sense, because they would have, in reality, they'd already gone to Hamburg in 1960 and they were quite well known. I think the other one, starting in 59, they've got it about right, because in 1959 there wasn't too much happening. They were playing at the Casbah sometimes, and they were really scratching around for gigs. But yeah, this prologue idea, I mean, you see this in, for example, the 1962 version of Mutiny on the Bounty, which we covered for Film Gold. You see the last man on Pitcairn's Island being discovered by an English ship, and then he winds them back to the beginning of the Bounty mission. Now, one of the reasons I think for the prologue was that earlier in 1979, Dick Clark had produced a pretty good Elvis TV film with Kurt Russell. I talked about that when I was on an Elvis podcast called TCB Cast a few years ago. I always had an affection for that. I think, again, it's has quite a lot of inaccuracies, but I definitely think it's better than this film. Kurt Russell as Elvis, and particularly Shelley Winters as his mother, they really captured something. But yeah, that's got a similar thing. That starts in 69, and then you go back to the very young Elvis strumming the first chords on his guitar. I do quite like that device. Now, Wendy Morgan, who, if we're talking about ages, I think it was 21 when she made this, so she's 14 years younger than her boyfriend and then later husband in the film, John. She gets the first line. She's Cynthia Lennon, by the way. She gets the first line, and the short scene in the car is based on Paul's line, apparently in reality, of saying America's got everything he wants. What does he want with the Beatles? And then we get a close-up of John with the line, "We had nothing to lose in them days." And this close-up of John really establishes him as, I would say, the focal point, almost as if it's his memory. That's, again, a device where everything's focused on John. And the fact, as I said, of him being so much older, he is that, I don't know, role model, guru, life coach, whatever you want to call it. So, yeah, we're back in 1959. We get shots of quite run-down buildings. I think it's in the Liverpool 8 area, which had the cathedral and the art college and the Liverpool Institute. One of my favourite Beatles books still is a book called Remember by Mike McCartney, with some of these wonderful photos from, as I said, this period of their life, which has become possibly the most fascinating, not musically, but just in terms of their lives. That late 50s, early 60s Liverpool just seems like a very exciting place to be, even though at the same time, I guess they were all trying to get away from it and see what else there was out in the world, because Liverpool wasn't quite what it is now. I mentioned that you get this soulful version of My Bonnie, which almost is a little bit of a theme of this film, and I'll explain why I think that is a bit later. We get the main three Beatles. They're in leathers, looking rough and ready and, a million miles away from world stardom. They're eating chips, which is quite a Beatles thing if you think of it. There's that I Feel Fine video, quote unquote, where it's just the Beatles eating fish and chips. And then there's an outtake from Magical Mystery Tour. Not from the film, really, but it was from the filming of the Beatles just entering a random fish and chip shop and being pictured eating chips. So they were into their chips, I think, all the way through. George is strumming a guitar and trying to figure out chords. So I guess it's a subtle indication that he's the diligent guitarist, and calls to mind that the Some Other Guy footage from the Cavern where John and Paul are the ones who are kind of performing, and George is just looking down at his guitar, making sure it's going well. Paul is more of a lad in this film than he's often portrayed, and that may be true. He probably was quite a bit like he is in this film, in a general sense. Then they're in the Liverpool alley, and Paul and especially George talk about their disapproving parents. And George he's kind of doing a bit of a George Harrison caricature. Oh, my dad wants me to get a better job. It's all that kind of thing. They start playing football in the street, a window's smashed, and they all scarper. So the impression you're given, Liverpool scruffs, just living on their wits, having a bit of fun, and I was going to say not worried about the consequences, well, they ran away, but you know what I mean, they're just kind of chances, as John calls them later, shiftless, happy-go-lucky lads. And then we cut to the art college, and the class is painting the nude model, which in reality was a lady called June Furlong. Famous story of John Lennon, the real John Lennon there, is that I think he was in the class and he hadn't drawn anything, and the teacher said, "Oh, aren't you going to draw anything of hers?" And he drew her wristwatch, which is a very John Lennon thing. Really fits with the way we think of him, just doing the opposite of what anyone would think. The whole point is a naked body, and he draws a picture of the only thing that isn't the naked body. He's dressed quite conventionally here, and in reality, Bill Harry once noted that John looked different from the creative but quite conventional artistic types at the art college.
With John Lennon, when he first came to the college, I noted him straight away because he stood out in the whole crowd. He was so unconventional. I remember so vividly the first time he stuck in my mind is in the art college canteen. He was stalking around. He had his DA haircut. He looked like a teddy boy. He had the old velvet collar. And everyone else was dressed in duffel coats. And it was like a standard uniform. There were duffel coats in sort of like a fawn colour, navy blue or grey. And they were all wearing them, and they were wearing these sort of polo neck sweaters in green or navy blue. And I suddenly thought, these are all the people who are supposed to be unconventional, and they're all conventionally dressed, and there's John. He looks completely different. He stands out like a sore thumb.
I always told me to being a teddy boy or an art student, 1 week I'd go to art school with my art school scarf on and my hair sort of down, and the next week I'd go in a leather jacket and tight jeans. So I can never make up my mind. And I've always been a little arty, that.
Cynthia Lennon herself, she described herself as fairly normal, maybe conventional in a lot of ways, but also artistic. Those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Paul and George arrive as Roy Rogers and Trigger, and there's quite a lot of comedy repartee played up here, and Mark Lewison again made a point of that in Tune In, that sometimes if the electrics broke down, George, being the electrician's apprentice, would try and fix them, and John and Paul would start doing almost like a comedy skit. So that's fairly true to life. I just think it's maybe a bit more childish here, I'm not sure. So anyway, John leaves this class in the college where the others are all diligently drawing the nude. Cynthia's there. Stu Sutcliffe we get to see here as well. We don't really get any sense of Stuart Sutcliffe as a great painter, as he apparently was. And we get this triumphant music as the three lads escape down the stairs of the art college to freedom. I think in reality they were trying to escape from the real world. I think anyone who gets kind of artistic ability or sporting ability, for example, is trying to use that as a way to avoid the dreaded 9 to 5. Though it's not 9 to 5 anymore, is it? It's more like 8 till 6 with no overtime. But yeah, there's that idea of the horror of a proper job. And you may know I reread the Coleman book, the updated version of it, and I think there's a scene where Mimi tells John there's a job going as it's either a bus driver or a bus conductor. Just quite funny to think of John Lennon doing that. But, it could have been. I mean, if the Beatles hadn't happened, he could have been persuaded to get a job like that. Right, the three Beatles, John, Paul and George, they get a bottle, play rugby with it for a bit, and then they're lying around tombstones. They're in a graveyard, basically. And quite hilariously, one of the graves just says Rigby. Not Eleanor Rigby, just Rigby in big letters. Of course, a lot of you will know the Eleanor Rigby grave was, quote-unquote, discovered or noticed in the 1990s in, I believe it is at St. Peter's Church, which is where John and Paul met at the Garden Fete in 1957. Paul had always said that Eleanor Rigby came from Eleanor Bron and a shop called Rigby's in Bristol. Had it stayed in his subconscious, I don't know, but it's so crude here just to have Rigby. But it is quite interesting that they get that gravestone 20 years or so before the real one was discovered in Liverpool. Or maybe everyone knew it was there. I don't know. I felt like that was something that was revealed in the 90s. We get another reference to George's dad pressuring him, and there is quite a good line from John. People die here, never knowing if they've ever lived. That was a rough approximation of John's accent.
People die here,
never knowing if they've ever lived.
That has the spirit of the kitchen sink dramas of the 60s. See, you can see how much I'm reading into this, hey? Every line gets analysed. I think it's in Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, which I did a review of once on a podcast called Ria Britannia. And I think it's in that one, Arthur Seaton, the main character, talks about people being dead from the neck up, the people around him. John Lennon kind of fits the angry young man archetype. And in fact, Saturday Night, Sunday Morning came out, I think, while they were in Hamburg. But yeah, there's a couple of nice little lines like that. So they've got no prospects. And then this is quite funny. George says, it's got to get better, can't get no worse, which of course is a reference to a 1967 song called Getting Better from the Sgt. Pepper album. John, the world-weary cynic, knows that things in fact can get a lot worse. Of course, John in reality is an example of someone where if you've had quite a lot of death in your life, you probably do grow up quite quickly. When I say grow up, perhaps I mean in the sense of realising that the world is not going to be all nice and comforting the way it's perhaps portrayed in certain TV programmes that you grow up with. Paul randomly suggests a change of leadership, but that's a point that doesn't really go anywhere. It's forgotten. And then suddenly Stu appears and he's won 60 quid. I think it was 65 in reality, but let's not split hairs. He famously sold this painting in the John Moores exhibition, and he's drafted into the group. And John's voice in this is really silly. He's got this funny accent where he says, "Meet our new Beatle." It's almost like he's taken Yellow Submarine and exaggerated it even more. It just sounds so ridiculous. And the other Musketeers, I'm going to call them, because there is a real sense that the main three Beatles are the three Musketeers, just waiting for the fourth one. And Stu Sutcliffe is a little bit of a Musketeer. Pete Best isn't really, but it's all for one and one for all. They maybe even say that in the script at some point. Anyway, they accept Stu.
Welcome, fellow Beatle.
Then we get the famous "Where we going, fellas?" which John used to say. Very interesting here. Maybe interesting isn't the word, but curious, let's say. The real one is "Where we going, fellas?" to the top. "Where's that, fellas?" to the topmost of the poppermost. There may have been slightly different wordings of that. In this film, it's "Where we going?" to the top. What top? The very top. And I think, well, why have they changed that? Is it just because, I don't know, they just want to give you something different? I can't imagine that there would be a copyright on that line. But interesting, in Nowhere Boy, it's "to the toppity top," which is sort of equally as cheesy as the one here. So I'd be curious to know if anyone knows whether they were told to change that. Are they not allowed to use the real line? I'm not sure. Going back to that line about "can't get no worse," that's an example, as I said, it's got to get better, can't get no worse, of surely a deliberate mistake. Then we cut to the Billy Fury, Larry Parnes audition. So it was an audition to find a group to back Billy Fury, and his manager was Larry Parnes, nicknamed Parnes Shillings and Pence. Now, this is May 1960 in reality. I don't know how far we've gone forward in this story, but let's say, okay, a few months. We get Gary Olson as Rory Storm. This film has got quite a lot of people who would be well known to people of a certain age who watch British TV. He plays Rory Storm. He was in a sitcom about 20 years later called 2.4 Children that was quite popular. Rory Storm, the lead singer of Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, famously had a stutter when he spoke but not when he sang, as they point out here. I do like the Scouse accents of a lot of the people here, not the Beatles especially. I think Paul's isn't too bad, but a lot of the other people in here, I'm not going to do an impression of their accents, but they seem to be accents of a particular time, because as we have discussed on this podcast, and in fact Ian Hart discussed in an interview as well, I guess because cities have taken over from towns. Obviously Liverpool was a city in those days, but everything's got bigger, and obviously there's more immigration, so you get accents have just tended to get softer. Obviously, if you go to a small village now, even in 2025, you'll hear very strong accents, but I just feel like the certain accent that's portrayed here is one that doesn't quite exist anymore. We get a pretty convincing Ray Ashcroft as Ringo Starr. I remember the first time I saw this, I was quite aware of Ringo Starr, even not knowing much about the Beatles, because he's so famous, that name. And he looks, although I went through the ages earlier, I think he was 27. So he's actually the same age as George and younger than Paul and John, but he looks slightly older, as Ringo was slightly older than the others. They comment on Ringo's nose and also the fact that he comes from the Dingle, which is supposed to be a rough area. Ringo says they're just cheeky working class lads. There's no Alan Williams in this film, who was the Beatles' manager/booking agent. I would say manager. I'm only saying that perhaps technically he wasn't their manager. But we do get someone I think is just named as agent in the cast, played by Lionel, I think it's pronounced that, Linal, Haft. He's one of those faces that you would know. I couldn't name all the things that he was in. He was in actually a thing called The Charmer, which was a really good series with someone who I will mention later, who is in this. He's clearly supposed to be Larry Parnes, or some version of Larry Parnes. There's a band playing using dance steps, and then the Silver Beatles play Dizzy Miss Lizzie. This is really splitting musical hairs. John says, because they have a replacement drummer who was Johnny Hutch in reality. John says, Dizzy Lizzie in E, and they actually play it in B flat, which is a weird key to play rock and roll. Another technical note, the guitars that John, Paul and George are playing in these early scenes are not correct. They sound quite competent here. Of course, if any of you heard the 1960 recordings, which are supposed to be at Fourth Lynn Road, but I'm not sure I believe that. I think some of them may have been recorded at the Art College, because they sound, the space they're in sounds quite cavernous. No pun intended. They weren't recorded at the Cavern. Well, maybe, who knows. But there's two tapes, and the second one sounds a bit better, and people might remember Hallelujah, I Love Her So, I'll Follow the Sun, One After 909. But the actual first of the two tapes contains these horrendously repetitive and quite boring 12-bar blues, just over and over. And I'd almost say it's kind of magical to hear it, only in the sense that if you think about what they sounded like about 3 years later, or even just say, take it further, 5 years later, making the Yesterday and You Got to Hide Your Love Away, Help, all those. I'll just play a little bit of these 12-bar blues. So this is what they might have sounded like. I think on this tape, I feel like it might be Paul doing the lead guitar, and maybe he wasn't really a lead guitarist at that time. I think when George is there, the lead sounds a lot better, but just listen to a little bit of this. In reality, I think George said in the anthology that they played okay at this audition. And surprisingly, in real life, the irreverent John was pictured getting the autograph of Billy Fury. And this picture can be seen online. Billy Fury was also from the Dingle and was born in 1940, the same year as John and Ringo. So he'd made it a little bit earlier. And he was also a songwriter, which somewhat debunks the myth that there weren't any other songwriters in Liverpool. Weirdly, they go inside, then they say hello to Rory and Ringo again, and they do a little bit of repartee, if you like, to explain why they haven't got a drummer. Again, you feel like this probably might have been what they did in real life, but it's just not particularly funny here, I would say.
I see you've taken pains to dress for the occasion.
These are all we have.
What kind of a name is Beatles?
Well, we started off as the Rainbows, then the Moondogs, then the Quarrymen.
Then the Nurk Twins. That's me and him, though. Then we thought of the Cricketers after Buddy Holly and the Crickets.
Insectiously speaking, we came to the Beatles.
And with a quick polish, the Silver Beatles, thank you very much.
I'm looking for musicians, not comics. Where's your drummer?
Yeah, well, you see, well, the thing is, I'm really glad you asked me that question.
He's out. Temporarily. Sick mum, no problem.
Hey, my sugarness, that's all I need.
Stu fakes the bass, and we have got a picture of him facing away from the camera. There are pictures from this audition. Some people said he couldn't play at all at this point. He obviously hadn't been in the band very long. This agent guy wants him to play without Stu, which is a bit weird, because if he's not playing, they're not going to sound any different. I didn't quite understand that. And then John says, no. He puts on this, I don't know, this sort of defiant face, but it just looks a bit comical to me. It gets similar to when he was getting angry in John Yoko Love Story. Sometimes it was quite effective, but sometimes it just looked a bit comical. They do take note when Rory plays of the funny-looking drummer, Ringo. And Ringo was quite, I don't know, maybe a strange-looking guy, quite a memorable-looking guy. But he also was a left-hander playing right-handed. So when they're watching him drumming, I think Ray Ashcroft actually does quite a good job of looking like he's got quite an unusual style on the drums. And then this is something that happens in all films. Everything happens very quickly. The agent says, they're the best band, talking about Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. They're the best band in Liverpool. And then says, look, lads, you can go to Scotland if you want. And then I might have some gigs in Hamburg. So, as I said, there's no Alan Williams here, this agent guy. Larry Parnes almost is apparently organising Hamburg. I mean, it doesn't matter, it's not, if you're not a big hardcore fan, you're not really going to know or care, really. Then we get Pete Best, whose mother, Mona, owns the teenagers' hangout spot, the Casbah Coffee Club. Here we get the fingerprints of Pete, the technical consultant, because this guy plays this extended drum roll, which is pretty impressive. I mean, it's very good drumming. In fact, we know from Complete Beatles that Alan Williams, some of his stories might be tall tales, but he said he auditioned Pete and asked him to do a role, and Pete did an okay role. Not great, but okay. And, of course, we know that they needed a drummer to go to Hamburg, and they got Pete in. That's not to say they weren't happy with him at various times. That issue will never get resolved, and we will talk about it later when it comes up in the story of Pete leaving. John encounters a bit of disapproval from a slightly paranoid Cynthia. They're at Strawberry Fields. This is another thing they do in Beatles biopics. I remember in Nowhere Boy, towards the end, I think it's John's 18th birthday, is it, where they have a big domestic incident and the whole history comes out with Julia and Mimi and everything. And John happens to try and get into the cavern. He goes all the way to the centre of Liverpool, and the guy on the door of the cavern chucks him out. We've already seen Eleanor Rigby's grave. So this is something they do, They play this quite sweet music, and they actually seem like quite a nice couple, even though, as we've said, the age difference of the actors was quite big. John refers to Liverpool or even Wilton as a dump that he wants to escape from, and he says that a couple of times. Liverpool was a working class city. It had its problems. It's obviously been greatly modernised in recent years, but certainly wouldn't call Wilton a dump. I think Wilton already was a kind of maybe a quaint village, or I think Rod Davis told me that it was a nice place to live. So maybe he's talking about Liverpool. But, it fits his narrative, that the narrative of the film really is the lads with a dream, and we've already seen that it gets accomplished. We know that from the prologue, depending which version you're watching. We get Aunt Mimi with a wonderful Scouse accent, sort of winding John up as John's packing to go to Hamburg. She mentions Julia. Of course, Beatles fans who know a decent amount about the Beatles already know the fate of Julia. She died in 1958, so it's fairly recent in this story. Julia is mentioned later as well. Next, they're in Hamburg. They're quite wide-eyed. They go to their digs, and John makes a remark about them, something about, not bad considering they lost the war. And we know that the real John, particularly when he got drunk or he was drinking and doing speed, he'd mentioned fucking Nazis and stuff like that, and by some accounts, the German crowd used to love it. Sometimes people like banter, even if there's sensitive history, it's wrong to presume that every citizen of a country is upset by their sensitive history. Because, of course, a lot of Germans and a lot of English and a lot of nations would have had no interest in the World War. It's only because of the propaganda that it's us against them and we have to get involved. I've said many times, you ask the average person, go to a pub that's got 100 people in. Not saying you're going to do this, but hypothetically, you could go to everyone in that pub and say, what do you think of war? Do you think we need to be at war with whoever? And they'd probably say, no, I've got no interest in that. I'm just getting on with my life. So it doesn't surprise me that much that they might have enjoyed that banter, particularly if everyone's drunk. Bruno Koschmieder, I think it's supposed to be Bruno, he's played by Richard Marner, who was originally a Russian who anglicised his name, but was well known for playing the colonel in A Lower Low, and he had a crazy accent, German colonel, crazy accent in A Lower Low, and he's a bit comical here as well. So it's a Russian guy playing Germans, apparently, specialising in them. Now, as far as Hamburg goes, you see some fights going on while they're playing, and one guy actually gets bottled, which looks pretty nasty. But, I mean, there's just, if you compare this to Backbeat, it's just night and day in terms of creating a sense of atmosphere. I don't know exactly where this was filmed, the Hamburg parts. And the clubs look pretty dead most of the time. I mean, it looks like there's hardly anyone in there, whereas Backbeat, you really got the sense of the excitement and the danger in those German clubs, and they haven't seen Backbeat for ages, but I remember the clubs being quite packed out. So, I mean, this is really, I think Hamburg might be the least impressive part of this film in terms of atmosphere. As I say, I think they got the Liverpool atmosphere not bad. Again, there's a little bit of playing with history. They play I Saw Her Standing There, which was written in 1962. And I've noticed, what you will notice as I go through this, they show the Beatles playing a lot of originals, whereas in fact, John and Paul had a partnership, and then I think in Tune In, it makes the point from 59 to about 62, there weren't really many songs being written by John and Paul. It seemed like Paul wrote quite a few in the early 60s. Love of the Loved, Like Dreamers Do, I'll Be On My Way, maybe that was a co-write. But yeah, interestingly, you don't see them performing or recording, in fact, I'll get to that a bit later, Cry for a Shadow, which they recorded in the Tony Sheridan sessions in 61. That would have been a good one to include here. They mention, we've been on stage for 9 hours, I think it was 8 hours generally, but there's no real sense of exhaustion. They just look slightly tired. I think Backbeat did such a good job of, they're tired and then they're given the prellies, and then we get that fantastic scene of them just, all speeding off their tits and the manic look in their eyes. They really did look like they were on amphetamines there. There's a slight mention of prellies later, which I'll get to. I said the band sound okay, but you just don't get that sense of them as a real hard rocking band. And in Backbeat, arguably they went over the top, and they got this grunge band. It was Dave Grohl, a couple of other people. So you had this grunge era band, and the Beatles arguably were early punks, really, particularly John Lennon in his behaviour. He was, as I've said before, basically a Sex Pistol, 15 years before the Sex Pistols. So that Backbeat band probably sounded better than the Beatles did. And similarly in Nowhere Boy, I remember when we reviewed that a few years ago, we said they made the Quarrymen sound a lot better than they actually probably were in 1957, 58. But, I mean, there's really no atmosphere here in these Hamburg scenes, to be honest. I quite like the cornflakes and milk scene. I guess that's supposed to be in the Seamen's Mission they used to go to, with John playing Mother, and he's saying Makshal, as he's there. The milk goes everywhere. It goes on the cornflakes and then just goes all over the table. I think the sense of them as clowning around, and that's their way of getting through all the hardship, I think that's fairly accurate. Rory, Storm and Ringo seem to be ever present, but we never seem to see the rest of Rory's band. You saw them at the audition, but it just seems to be those two. George now plays on stage Don't Bother Me, which is hilarious because that was written in late 63. That was on the With the Beatles album. And the others lark about. You get a bit more of Pete Best as a nifty drummer. He's catching his stick very handily at one point. John Bonham used to do that, and other drummers used to do that. There's really no mention of their sex lives at all, whereas, again, in Backbeat, they're having sex in the bunks, and there's that funny bit where Stuart Sutcliffe's shagging a girl on one bunk and John's on the other bunk, and Stuart obviously climaxes and John's saying to him, "Are you enjoying Hamburg, Mr. Sutcliffe? Are you happy you came?" I think there's so much about Backbeat that's way better than this in terms of the Hamburg scenes. We see the boys in silver cowboy boots, which just look ridiculous on these guys. And this is another thing where you don't really notice it until you're watching a film closely for a podcast. But they see a poster advertising Rory Storm, and John, in marker pen, adds, "and the Beatles." You know, he's not happy that they're not on the poster, but why would John Lennon, in his leathers, be walking around Hamburg with a marker pen in his pocket? I know it doesn't matter, but it's just one of those funny things where you can be deceived when you're just watching a film and you don't notice things which are completely ridiculous. And we see George playing in just black pants, as in underwear, and a hat. And John does have a toilet seat round his neck at one point. So they do a bit of that, but again, done much better in Backbeat, because here they just, there's nothing edgy about this band. And really that comes from the top, really. If John Lennon is the focal point of this, apart from pulling a few stern faces, he's much more of a life coach, kindly guru figure than the very acerbic John Lennon. And I think Ian Hart in Backbeat wasn't trying to capture him perfectly accurately. He wasn't doing an impression of him, but he captured a certain spirit and a certain ability to be nasty that was in John Lennon, and none of that is here at all. Yeah, I put in my notes, being in these Hamburg clubs with this version of the Beatles, it's like being in space, complete lack of atmosphere. They pour water down George's back as he sings Roll Over Beethoven. That's quite funny. And again, you know, we don't know if the real Beatles did that, but I've always said with biopics, if you have lines that they might have said or things that they might have done, it doesn't matter if they did or not, because it fits with what we broadly know about them. So all the clowning is quite good. That sense of fun, as I said. Now we get the introduction of Astrid, but she seems to know Rory and Ringo already. Again, they're playing with history. It's not the end of the world. We don't get any Klaus Vormann here or Jürgen Vollmer. Stu and Astrid clock each other, and I think there was a bit of an error here, because in the next scene, Stu's already got the Beatle cut, which he won't get till later. I think that was just a mistake. Sorry to keep going back to Backbeat, but the chemistry there between Stephen Dorff and Cheryl Lee was just so much more than here. I mean, I remember in Backbeat they have a kind of animalistic sex scene, and it's really effective, and you can really see, you know, how horny they are. Astrid and Stu here, they just, I'd almost say their relationship seems a bit more polite, maybe if that's the word. Arguably, Stephen Dorff's Stu in Backbeat was maybe too much of a lad, whereas this guy doesn't seem to have anything to him, really. There's no sense of magic, as I said, of magic of him as a painter. He just seems a little bit lifeless somehow. Astrid just seems like almost like generic artistic German girl, and she seems to speak English already, which is, once again, is not the reality. Maybe that was the same in Backbeat as well. We get Ask Me Why, which is another original, with a montage of photos, but you might think it would just be the group shots that Astrid took, which were the prototype for With the Beatles album cover and those other ones that were inspired by her. But this is a photo montage including, you know, the lads falling asleep on tables as well. But we get some, again, the sense of fun and camaraderie, certainly with Rory, Ringo and the Beatles, but not much else. Just a word on Ask Me Why. Ask Me Why and P.S. I Love You were the B-sides of the first two Beatles singles, chronologically the other way around, and were far more sophisticated songs than their A-sides. P.S. I Love You was a B-side of Love Me Do, and Ask Me Why was a B-side of Please Please Me. The A-sides were chosen deliberately to maybe be more commercial, certainly in the case of Please Please Me, but Ask Me Why and P.S. I Love You, both, they've got some really interesting chords, and it's interesting that the two B-sides were like that, less commercial, but showing a certain sophistication. There's two scenes in this film of John writing letters to Sin, but I just can't marry... Oh, that was a deliberate pun, that one. The guy we see here with the guy in the letters, and I'm going to read one of those letters a bit later. Meanwhile, this is the Pete Best thing again. We can hear Pete practicing one of his long and very good drum workouts. There's some sense of Paul and Stu's friction, but again, it was a bit more developed in Backbeat, and it was explained a bit more. This is just depicting the events, but there's really no depth to anything here, I've got to be honest. It's just there in passing. We get more of John as a group's guru, you know, the guy that is offering advice to everyone and knows what the world's like. We see Stu do Love Me Tender, which he did in reality. And then all of a sudden, George is hauled off by the police for being too young. Paul and Pete accidentally start a pretty big fire, actually, when they're looking for George's fake birth certificate among their luggage. And we get this quite TV movie dramatic or melodramatic music. In reality, George was deported. It was all to do with the fact that the Beatles were going to switch to the Top 10 Club, which they played in 1961. And apparently Bruno Koschmider was obviously upset about that. Maybe they already knew George was underage, I'm not sure. But Paul and Pete Best apparently set fire to a condom, but they didn't start this huge fire that we see here. And then we go forward to John, 35-year-old John, if you take the age of the actor, but he's supposed to be 20 here. Arriving back at Mendip's, it's not the same house. They've obviously not tried to reproduce Mendip's. And being sent to his room by Aunt Mimi, who taunts him about the £100 a week that he was supposed to have been earning. I like the accent of the cabbie. It's a proper Liverpool accent.
That's 15 and 6 there.
Can you hang on a minute?
In reality, John was the last to arrive home, and it was the early hours of the 8th of December, which wasn't quite 20 years to the day that he died, because, of course, when John Lennon was shot and killed, it was the early hours of the 9th of December in Britain. So 20 years and a day before his life was ended 3,000 miles away in New York. As the real John was arriving, it was, like I said, the middle of the night. John F. Kennedy had just won the US election and would be sworn in January 61. And 5 presidents later, at the time that John was gunned down, after Johnson, Nixon, Ford and Carter, we had President Reagan, who just won the election. So from Kennedy to Reagan, that's almost John Lennon's entire adult life. It's quite strange that that would happen. 8th of December was also the day, 10 years after this, that he would record the Lennon Remembers interview. That's quite fascinating. 1960 was the year that the Beatles really broke through, thanks to Hamburg. Then John did the famous interview 10 years later where he's almost debunking what had happened in the interim or what we thought had happened. And then the end of his life was 10 years after that. Very strange. Paul and George meet at the docks. We get, again, the My Bonnie music. And I think it's something to do with the fact that, you know, the lyrics, My Bonnie lies over the ocean. And although they're actually by the River Mersey rather than the ocean, it's something to do with water and sailing away out of your present reality to explore pastures new. And of course, once upon a time, you know, Liverpool was a port, and that was the way to get around. You know, for long voyages before planes was, of course, sailing. Talking to that, in fact, they use another water motif because Paul and George decide they need to carry on. Because obviously after Hamburg, in reality, the Beatles were quite dispirited. And Paul and George arrive at Mendip's in the rain. And quite a good line for George. It's not raining, it's Liverpool crying. So they're using rain to be quite evocative here. The Beatle dream being kept alive. They go in through the front door, which never happened in reality. Stu's already in John's bedroom, and it's quite a large bedroom, much bigger than in reality. They're having toast and listening to what sounds like very generic beat music. Doesn't really sound like a rock and roll hit. John gets the deciding vote as Chief Beatle in terms of carrying on. Right, I think I'm about halfway through my notes at this point. We've also had the guitar lesson at the beginning to beef up this episode. So I'm gonna leave it there. So the Beatles have decided to carry on after getting chucked out of Hamburg, and we're at the back end of 1960 in the story here. So we'll pick up where we left off there in the next episode. I knew it'd be a two-parter. Almost could have told you that for sure, because I said I've got a lot of notes here, but I hope you're enjoying it so far. It's interesting to always look at biopics, even fairly bad ones like this, and see what devices they use to change the story. So we've seen some condensing of characters or just removal of characters and various other things, like emphasising the fact that the Beatles wrote and played their own music. Just a little callback to the beginning of this episode where I played Working Class Hero. After the music, you're going to hear two versions of that. One by yours truly with the wonderful Marco Cinelli from the Cinelli Brothers band. They did a gig in Gillingham, quite near me here in Kent. And Marco asked me to do an acoustic set, and I hadn't played for a few years. It's the only gig I've actually done since 2019. And I just did a few of my original songs, but I did do Working Class Hero, and Marco is just a fantastic lead guitarist. Not just blues, I feel like he could probably do anything. He came on stage and he did some lead guitar with me. So you hear that. And then the second one, I'll give John Lennon the last word, or the last performance. This is quite rare, actually. It was online, but it disappeared. But I used it on a show years ago. We did a show about 1972 with Mick Ord. This is a rehearsal of Working Class Hero. It's John Lennon and the Elephants Memory Band rehearsing for the one-to-one concert. Of course, quite topical with the documentary having come out recently. It's a bit rough, but it's definitely an interesting thing to hear that song sounding different, and the fact that it was potentially going to be played at that one-to-one concert. So that's that, and I'll be back very soon for the next episode. If you'd like to help out the show, there are links in the show notes to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. You can make one-off donations to support my podcast work across my 3 shows, my own little podcast network. So this one, Life and Life Only, and Film Gold. Thanks very much for listening. See you soon. Goodbye.
Take this, brother. May it serve you well.
We're going to do a song by some boy called John Lennon, and I think he's well overrated. But... So yeah, a song by a very overrated bloke called Lennon. This is Working Class Hero. It's not one of his most optimistic songs. Sorry. Feel small, by giving you no time instead of it all. Till the pain is so big you feel nothing at all. A working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be. They hurt you at home and they hit you at school. They hate you if you're clever and they despise a fool. So you're so fucking crazy you can't follow their rules. A working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be. And they tortured and scared you for 20 odd years. And then they expect you to pick a career. Can't really function, you're so full of fear. A
TV. You think you're so clever and classless and free, but you're still fucking pleasant as far as I can see. The working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be. This room at the top, they are telling you still. But first you must learn how to smile as you kill. If you want to be like the folks on the hill. A working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be. If you want to be a hero, well, just follow me. If you want to be a hero, well, just follow me.
There's room at the top. They are telling you still. But first you must learn to smile as you kill. I want a big smile from everyone on that line. If you want to be, yeah, like the folks on the hill. To be a working class hero is something to be. If you want to be a hero, well, just follow me. I said you wanna be a hero, well, just follow me. Well, if you want to be a hero, well, just follow me.